Is Worcester, Massachusetts a city of queerness or a city of murder? That's what we're asking today on 508, a show about Worcester. It's October the 12th, 2018.
I already regret coming in today, Mike.
I am Mike Benedetti. This is Brendan Melican. To answer whether Worcester is more about queerness or more about murder, Brendan, I think we should start with this report from the Human Rights Campaign.
All right.
What do you think?
Bring it on. This
is the Municipal Equality Index report for 2018. Have you taken a look at this?
I have not. Nice drawing on the front, though. Who did that?
Somebody from the Human Rights Campaign. The Human Rights Campaign, for those who are unclear because it has such a vague term, this is the pro-gay rights organization that has the famous yellow equals sign you see on people's bumper stickers. That's the Human Rights Campaign.
Also known for their napkin doodles that they use for the covers of their reports.
Oh, it's a nice drawing.
Yeah.
So this report is looking at how LGBTQ-friendly cities are from a perspective of municipal government, like how friendly City Hall is. Like the chances that, let's say, an out gay person is going to get beat up in your city, that's not the kind of thing that this report is looking at, or like whatever, how many gay bars you have or how good your pride parade is. This is looking at on the municipal city government level, how good things are. Worcester is actually really good. Worcester gets 97 out of 100 and then gets 8 bonus points, meaning that Worcester has a final score of 100 because they won't give you more than 100, even with the bonus points.
All right.
We do not get, there are 2 categories where we do not get a perfect score. One is inclusive workplace, where we get a 0 out of 2. Inclusive workplace in this report would give us points if we had an LGBTQ pride group alliance or resource group, or an LGBTQ inclusive diversity training for city staff, or a recruitment program that actively advertises available positions to the LGBTQ community. So I guess city government in Worcester is not doing a good job organizing or recruiting LGBTQ employees, so they give us 0 for that category.
When they talk about training, so they're not figuring in like the ethics training and the sort of like harassment and sensitivity trainings that are kind of the norm now?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of trainings, right, for city employees, so I'm kind of surprised that our current trainings don't include that kind of stuff. It also makes me think, though, back to the many complaints about the Human Rights Campaign from the queer community. And I don't know if this is emblematic of them, but this is a complaint I have about this report, is that this report seems to take diversity training really seriously as a positive step, whereas I feel like in recent years, everything I read about diversity training makes me think it's not actually helpful. It's just the kind of thing that, it's potentially counterproductive in that it would give the city a fig leaf.
Right.
So if there were managers on the city level who were actively hostile to gay employees, but somehow could keep it under the radar, but the city had a diversity training, then if somebody says, hey, there's a manager hostile to gay employees, I feel like the city's doing a bad thing. The city can turn around and say, but we have diversity training, guys. Yeah. We're doing everything we can do. And then you have to say, well, I guess. I don't know.
I think it's, as someone who has spent decades, I'm sure as you have too, sitting through numerous trainings along those lines, it's hard not to get the and also someone who likes to think of themselves as a relatively unbigoted person, they always kind of struck me as the sort of thing that's like, okay, we know a lot of you in this room are thinking this, but here are the things we never want to hear you say. Like from a human resources perspective, that's really not about training your staff how to be better human beings. It's more like, these are the things that we don't ever want to hear come out of somebody's mouth or see somebody do because it's going to open us up for a terrible lawsuit, and we don't want that to happen.
Yes.
I would be shocked if a lot of that wasn't already included in the city hall's way of doing things.
I feel, especially considering we do so well otherwise. I think the other thing where we don't get a perfect score is we could have gotten 3 points on municipal leadership's pro-equality legislative or policy efforts, and we only get 2 points. So we lose a point there. We get extra points for things like city bullying, prevention policy for city services, providing service to LGBTQ youth, homeless, elders, providing services to the HIV/AIDS population, trans community. Actually, we don't get any points for helping the trans community. But all those things we get points for. So,
what was the second one that we lost points for?
We don't have a perfect record as far as legislative or policy efforts.
Okay.
Yeah, but
You'd think we'd have a
sub.
subcategory there where we'd also get extra credit in that category as being like the city that kind of kicked off our national movement for same-sex marriage.
I mean, we are kind of like we really are the gay marriage capital of the world, I would say.
This is kind of like Boston getting extra credit for the first reading of the Declaration of Independence, totally ignoring the star in front of our city hall, right? It's like, yeah, I know, we don't get a lot of attention for the sexy things that we do, but we do them, and we do them pretty awesome.
I mean, Brendan, Delaware still makes a big deal about the fact that they were the first state to sign the Constitution of the Declaration of Independence or something, right?
Delaware.
So I mean, people take what they can get. I was looking at some of the other cities, and I noticed a familiar city to me. Parkersburg, West Virginia, is ranked on this list. This is the city where I went to high school, and a city where I still go a couple of times a year, and a city I have a great deal of affection for, and a city that instead of getting a 100% got a 13%.
All right. Well, congratulations, Parkersburg.
In this case, it's easier for me to talk about things where Parkersburg actually got points. Parkersburg actually got points for properly reporting hate crime statistics to the FBI. It got a 12 out of 12 on that, so that's good. And the thing that we lost a point on, they actually got 1 point for their legislative or policy efforts on the municipal level. So good job, Parkersburg. I mean, that's the thing, though. Like, you get a 12 for properly reporting hate crime statistics? That seems weird.
That seems like a give me. You know, like if you're not reporting your crime stats to the Department of Justice, you've probably got bigger issues to worry about.
Yeah. I mean, we can talk, too, about, like, cities that do like a city that does a bad job in Massachusetts, for example, would be Lowell, who has a 48. Most of the cities in this, there's a bunch of 100% in the Commonwealth, and there's a bunch of high-ranking cities in the Commonwealth, in part because I think state legislation mandates that they do it.
And we're kind of awesome.
Well, and this maybe, but this report sort of also highlights cities in states where the state is not mandating that they do a good job, where they still do a good job, such as Huntington, West Virginia, not too far from Parkersburg, West Virginia, which gets a 95. Good job, Huntington. Yeah. Morgantown, West Virginia, home of WVU, gets an 80. A lot better than average. So, good job, Morgantown. Anyway, so, okay. I mean, from that perspective, we're a pretty gay-friendly city, Brendan.
Congratulations, Worcester.
Congratulations, Worcester. I wanted to look at something where we maybe did a bad job on, so I looked at crime statistics.
Oh, did we screw something up again?
Well, I mean, I just noticed on Wikipedia that there was a giant list of crime statistics. I think these are 2016 statistics. And
okay.
I'm going to compare these to Worcester's 2017 statistics. Murder-wise, I think we're actually doing better than a lot of cities in the United States. Also, vehicle theft-wise, we're actually not doing too bad. In terms of aggravated assault and robbery, we're probably in the lower 50% of major U.S. cities.
That's not good.
No, but that's about all I can say. Yeah, that's about all I can say. I mean, I think about, we were just listening to the Worcester Magazine show, and they were talking about people's childhood fears of the city of Worcester.
Sure.
And like how violent is Worcester? Like Worcester has the murder rate of San Diego. Worcester has the aggravated assault rate of New York City or Seattle. Worcester has the motor vehicle theft rate of Jersey City or Mobile, Alabama. Like, I don't know. I mean, none of these cities are well-known hellholes, so I sort of feel like Worcester is not so bad as American cities go.
No, and I think the big takeaway, and it's hard to see this anymore, it's hard to have, like, individual successes with American cities because crime in general, especially violent crime, has been trending downward now for a solid 3 decades.
Yes.
So it's harder to pull meaning out of those numbers as they get smaller and smaller because you're starting to get into, unfortunately, statistical rounding errors sort of territory.
Right. I mean, this is the thing about dwelling on Worcester's murder rate that I'm a little worried about, which is that we don't have a lot of murders, so one murder more or less really kind of determines whether we had an amazing year or a terrible year. This was a year, for example, where there was one murder where they dumped the body in an adjacent town, the town of Holden. Yeah. And therefore, Holden now has this sky high for the murder rate, and we have a lower murder rate than usual just because of this kind of a thing. And whenever those kinds of things are what's determining how great your statistics look, like, you should be glad that you have so few murders that those kind of things, throw it one way or the other. But it also means that talking about it is not that helpful.
Right.
We're going to talk about transit in Worcester. Brendan, I have 2 hooks for transit in Worcester this week.
Hit me.
One of them is we're not going to have any service cuts. Oh, I knew it was going to happen this way. I knew it every time. They're just like,
it does always happen that way.
They're just like, oh, it's going to be an apocalypse, and you look at the numbers and you're like, it is going to be an apocalypse, and then they just move a lot of things around behind the scenes, and then they're like, yeah, nothing's going to happen.
But that's actually the most genius way of doing nothing in politics, though, right? Or bureaucracy is like you threaten massive cuts, and then you level fund. And because people are just relieved that there's not going to be massive cuts, we take our eyes off the reality that the costs of things have actually risen in the same time frame, and without an increase, a significant increase in funding, you're actually still behind.
It's aggravating. Anyway, I mean, I just don't like being jerked around like that. I also don't feel like that massive service cuts in Worcester are like the kind of thing which maybe could just kind of get figured out real quick and like maybe couldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
That really makes it seem much more precarious than I would like it to be.
Right.
Transit funding in Worcester.
Do you have any idea? I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, so I'm hoping you do.
Yeah.
Where the leadership at the WRTA is headed?
You mean because like the fact that they let the previous RTA guy left or whatever?
I just haven't seen anything bubble up, and I'm not sure if you wasn't sure if you'd caught anything.
I don't know about that. I do know that we're potentially going to have a new center platform at Union Station.
All right.
This is something which would then let us have. I'm reading an article from Cyrus Moulton in the Telegram and Gazette. It would mean that you could have two commuter trains in the station at a time, which meant that you could more tightly schedule trains, or that you wouldn't necessarily have like these kinds of crazy delays that you now have because you can only have one train at a time. This kind of, I can't figure out if this is what they call a high train platform or not. It doesn't say anything in any of the documentation I've read. I was going back to this article, this proposal that we had read from the group Transit Matters back in the winter, Regional Rail for Metropolitan Boston, and they had one of their 7 things that they were looking for that they thought we could actually do that would be better for our regional rail. One of them was high-level platforms, basically platform improvement, so that trains could load faster. Mm-hmm. Trains would be more accessible. I mean, I know this new Worcester platform is going to be an accessible platform, so that's good. Anyway, this kind of makes me think that maybe we're doing like something good and visionary. In terms of following one of these 7 things in Worcester.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think one of the problems with getting our train system shored up the way we all know and have known it needed to be was ridership was not necessarily always as high as we would have liked it to be.
Yeah.
Just basic supply and demand stuff. It seems like, I mean, if you're a commuter into Boston now, your commuting time is, from a driving perspective, is now well over 2 hours on a regular basis.
Holy cow.
And if that's the case, but I also hear from my friends that are commuters by train that the trains are getting fuller and fuller.
Yeah.
Is, I mean, it just does make sense that finally we've got I think it's like the issue with anything in Worcester. It's the density problem, right? Like we know what we need to do to make something solid, but we also need to be able to show that there's going to be some use before we start shoveling money onto something. I think we actually are getting to the point where the density is there and the actual need is there, not hypotheticals. And so now we're kind of racing to make improvements that hopefully will take the edge off.
Commodity prices are down this week, Brendan. Brent crude oil is $80 a barrel, down 5% on the week, and Bitcoin is $6,200, down 5% on the week. We have this report, Brendan, from the Research Bureau. I want to get all of my complaining and all of my snarking out of the way at the top, and then we will have a snark-free, bitching and moaning-free discussion of this report.
Perfect.
So the Research Bureau, ever since their terrible, terrible cable report of about 10 or 15 years ago, where they got most of the fundamental numbers wrong and then refused to acknowledge this publicly.
Under very different leadership at the Research Bureau, just so.
Under very different leadership, but with the same name. I think if they were truly repentant, they would change the name to not the Research Bureau. Anyway, so an organization that I'm always very skeptical of and like to check the numbers of because they have a bad track record, to my mind. I want to complain also that this is reported called City on the Move, which, dear God.
We need new slogans.
Snark out of the way and complain about the Research Bureau out of the way. There's a report called City on the Move, an overview and assessment of Worcester's transportation needs as of September 2018. Here are some highlights. Brendan, did you know that Worcester's economic success derives from its importance as a transportation nexus? I feel like me attempting to read the first sentence of this report out loud comes across as snark. So maybe I should stop doing that kind of thing.
No, but it's actually a genius way to open the report, because I think anyone that's ever paid attention to black markets in the Northeast has always recognized, or if you've got some cop friends or whatnot, I'm sure almost anybody would be happy to tell you that the amount of narcotics that flow north up through the highways like 91 and 84 and whatnot, leading to Central Mass, is an important part of the black market economy. So, and that's an easy thing to see. I think that regular standard economies are sometimes a little bit more complex and difficult to see just how important a region may be in aiding them. But yeah, we totally are. I mean, transportation is kind of the backbone of who we are, because we're arguably the most central city to New England.
Well, there's a lot of traveling that people do in and out of Worcester on a daily basis. There's 100,000 jobs in the city, and 2/3 of those are from non-Worcesterites, and 40,000 people from the city commute out of the city every day. So there's this 100,000 people coming in and out of the city commuting every day.
So 40,000 are leaving?
40,000 are leaving.
Wow.
65,000 are coming in. I actually think that's kind of a good... I think that's kind of good in some ways. I think about Manhattan. When I lived in Manhattan, I think the daytime population of Manhattan was 5 million, and I think that the residential population of Manhattan was 1.5 million. So it was massively people out of the city coming in to work there. I think that probably for a city, that's probably generally a good thing. It's especially. I think it's probably also. It's probably healthy that we have more people coming in and going out too, just as far as we're actually a center of jobs rather than a place that people just have to live in order to live near a job in a different city. Something that was surprising to me was that 6% of Worcester residents walk to work. That seems so high.
There are dozens of you, Mike.
I'm definitely one of these people. 72% of them drive alone, 12% carpool. The commute times for Worcester residents, and this is a Census Bureau statistic, is most Worcester commuters take 5 to 29 minutes a day to commute. I would almost all. There's some who take more than an hour and a half, and some who take less than 5.
Is 5 minutes really constitute a commute? And how do they even have less than 5 minutes as a? It would take me long. That's the money. It takes me longer than that just to figure out how to get out of bed in the morning and make my way to the bathroom.
I am self-employed, but I sometimes have to go into people's offices, and there are people's offices who are 5 minutes from my house.
Okay.
Who I go to walk to work to sometimes, but that is really close. That is I feel like that's telecommuting. I feel like less than 5 minutes is what I usually do, which is roll out of bed and start typing and making some money.
Go from this side of the room to that side of the room. Yeah.
But very few people have more than an hour commute, and very few people even have more than 30-minute commute. So I'm guessing that most of these Worcesterites are.
Those numbers are actually kind of shocking, because we were just talking about transit out of the city via train, and I think most people are thinking of that as
the main thing.
Boston folks, or folks headed to Boston, as well as how terrible, from what I hear, because I don't do it anymore, the commute into Boston from Worcester has become. That last chart made it seem like there's pretty much nobody going to Boston. The high end of the commuting number is 90 or more minutes. That's, what is that, around 2,000 people?
Yeah.
That's a non-existent number. From this bar here, if you're figuring 30 minutes is about the time it's going to take you to totally traverse the city from one side to the other at its longest possible distance, during rush hour. So that's kind of suggesting that where people are going are just our neighboring communities.
Yeah. So it's a very tight regional economy. Yeah. So again, there's plenty of people coming in from Boston and going out to Boston, but statistically, percentage-wise, it's not a lot.
Right.
There's a little section here about regional transit. It mentions that probably 70% of WRTA riders have an income of less than $25,000 a year. The WRTA made 3.8 million passenger trips in 2017, so about 10,000 passenger trips a day. So, when you think about, if we're talking about 100,000 commuting trips a day for people's work in and out of the city, 10,000 trips a day is not nothing. It's not massively key to the regional economy, but it's not nothing. We can get back to the number that the operating cost per passenger trip is $5.50.
Do they consider a trip? I hate to be picking away on details here, but I just want to make sure I understand where we're headed here. Do they count a trip round trip or each way?
I think it's one way.
Okay, so in all likely, I mean, if we're really talking about, in all likelihood, that's going to be 5,000 people moving by bus per day if they're coming and going. Counting the number of trips, I guess, is a little bit fuzzy, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily, if you're trying to get a handle on how much usage there actually is in the WRTA, you'd probably want to look at it both coming and going as one unified sort of trip. It's like whatever the return to the point of origin is.
Yeah, and we can look at the number of people in Worcester who get to work by public transit is 4%.
Okay.
So again, it's not a lot, and
right.
We can mention that for the
2% are walking, you said?
Yeah. So, no, more than that. 6%.
Okay.
The operating cost per passenger trip for demand response vehicles is almost $27. So again, whenever if you're mobility impaired and you got to call the special van, we had Jared Donardo on here talking about her adventures doing this. It's like so much money. It's like very expensive for us to take people around in these vans. I mean, it's better than them not riding the van, but again, just in terms of keeping those numbers in mind, whenever somebody says, oh, hey, we should be using Uber and Lyft to do this, and you say, my God, it takes $8 to take Lyft across the city. It's like, well, it takes the RTA like maybe $5 to get people where they're going, so not that much. I want to mention something completely perpendicular to this, and then we'll go to a break, which is that tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of the death of Cornelius Kelley, Kelley Square's namesake, and there is going to be a memorial event with people from the military and people from the clergy and people from the city tomorrow at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock Saturday in Kelley Square. They'll have a wreath. They'll have Bob Largess and his horses drawing a hearse. It will be a good event to remember a man who died in the First World War and who gave his name to one of our beautiful, one of our most Worcester things. We were just looking at the section of this report on ride sharing, which is mentioning that there are 4.7 origin trips per person in Worcester per year. Statewide, it's more like half a trip per person. So, a lot of people in Worcester, 10 people in Worcester are riding the Lyft and the Uber 10 times more than the average Massachusetts resident.
There's not really much in here on that front, but I was just curious. What I was looking for was, it seems as though this fall is when Lyft is going to start actively engaging governments in terms of being a participant in their muni transportation plans and whatnot. And it's the Secretary of Mass DOT is on their steering committee. So it would seem as though at some point in time we should start seeing at least some integration between the way Lyft, at least, not necessarily Lyft and Uber, but Lyft at least functions alongside the regional RTAs.
I would love to see it. I'm a big rideshare user, mostly a Lyft user, and I'm always trying to use the weirdest add-ons to Lyft that I can, and none of them ever work in Worcester. Like again, when we had Jerry on, we tried to get the assisted van.
No assisted van.
No, you can't get an assisted van in Worcester via Lyft. Forget about it. The section in here on biking is also doesn't have a lot of info that I want to talk about on the radio. There's a section about being pedestrians in Worcester. It mentions that it lists the most dangerous intersections for pedestrians in Worcester from the years 2001 to 2014. I'm kind of stunned. Like the most dangerous injury-wise has 13 injuries in those years. Basically, an injury a year.
Huh.
The one with the most fatalities in that time is Park Avenue and Parker Street.
Where is that, Mike?
Park and Parker is like there's like an Austin Liquor there. There used to be a Blockbuster down there. It's kind of on your way to Big Y. Kind of if you're going from down to Big Y from Park Avenue. So really, the thing is, there's pedestrian fatalities in Worcester all the time, as I know from reading the paper. Mostly, it seems to me, people crossing Lincoln Street or people doing weird things on the interstate. So these intersections, I feel like this chart is not helpful. This is just me. This is just aimless complaining, which is that this chart is not helpful.
It assumes that people are actually using crosswalks, and we tend to put those in intersections.
That's I hadn't considered that, but that's a good way to put it, which is that intersections are much less important to pedestrian life in Worcester than this report assumes.
Well, actually, they're very important to pedestrian life, but they are not, because they're not used sometimes. Yeah,
they're not where people are getting hurt. Which is good. Hey, use the intersection, don't get hurt. That's what we're learning here. There's a good section in here about train transportation. We had in 2016 there were about 1,500 people a day who were riding the train out of Worcester to their work. So that's how many people.
1,500, huh?
1,500.
I figured we'd be above that now. This is, what I love about this study.
A couple years ago.
Is we've talked about this a couple times recently, where I think one of the funny things about Worcester, especially the longer you're here, the easier it is to think that you got the whole place figured out, right? And then all it takes is like a turn down a different street to realize, like, oh, I don't know anybody in Worcester. I don't have any idea what's going on. And I love that, like constantly rediscovering the city. If I think through like my universe, and I think part of that is because I spent so much time commuting to Boston myself, in my head you'd have a hard time convincing me that everybody in Worcester doesn't just get up in the morning and shift 43 miles to the east going to Boston.
Yes.
But that's just obviously my experience, and that experience clearly does not play it out in the numbers in any meaningful capacity.
I mentioned this on the show many times over the last 12 years, which is that since my connection to Worcester started off with people in Worcester who were struggling and continues to involve a lot of people who are struggling, I really have a hard time imagining that there are people in Worcester, that at least most people in Worcester have a job, have a house, don't have, if not a addiction to heroin, then a very active heroin practice.
Right.
But I think that's actually not true, that most people in Worcester don't have a heroin thing, and they do have some source of income. But
I think that is safe to say, yeah. But
my people, not that way.
But, that's going back to like where we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, and I think the show before us, that's kind of what they're honing in on, right? Like people look at the novelty of like figuring out a city and whatnot, and deciding how it's changing and why it's changing and whatnot. So much of that is just based on simple observations by an individual that don't actually mean anything. If your day to day is you're engaged with a lot of people who are struggling with addiction and may be on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, that's kind of how you're going to view Worcester, and you can kind of start to understand why there are so many people outside the city who have such a negative view of the place, because really all they see are old reports, like crime reports on TV or in the newspaper or whatnot, that don't actually play themselves out very frequently. But from an outsider perspective, that's all you're going to see. Someone like myself that does have a house and is employed, and most of my circle falls into that same category, my view in the city is like, wow, things are fantastic. But neither of those things are actually realistic and mean anything whatsoever.
Yes. Brendan, something on this that really confused me, that you can probably explain this to me, because
Probably not.
I'm not sure that this paper explains this to me. So the total container traffic through the CSX Worcester Freight Terminal went up between 2011 and 2017, went up tenfold.
Okay.
That's meaning a lot.
Well, isn't that because of the new CSX rail yard?
I think it is, yes. Although that was in 2013, according to this, that happened. So it went up fourfold. It almost doubled in 2012, and then from 2012 to 2013, it tripled. That's that initial thing. But then it kept going up steadily from there.
Yeah.
I guess I hadn't realized that it was such a big deal. Mm-hmm. Like, I thought it was a big deal. Maybe like it doubled it or went up like 20% or something. I hadn't realized it was going to go up 10 times.
Well, I think that's going back to how we opened this up too, right? Like, the opening paragraph there, which I think you kind of correctly chuckled at, but talking about the importance of transportation to the region. When we talk about transportation, especially when you and I talk about transportation, we're usually talking about people walking or taking ride shares or buses or whatnot. But when you look at it from an economic perspective, it's the transportation industry, and we're talking about 30,000 people driving trucks, long haul, and we're talking about massive numbers of containers that are moving around. It oftentimes doesn't actually have anything to do with the people moving. The people moving is just kind of like an accessory byproduct to these massive systems that are the foundation of our economy, and we're kind of a hub on that front.
There's an interesting statistical parallel here, which is that the total number of containers that pass through Worcester every year is about as many as the total number of commuters that pass through Worcester every day.
Yeah,
about 100,000 in both cases.
But it's those containers are full of things, right?
Fun fact.
Yeah,
that was a fun fact. There's a section about the airport, but I don't feel like there's anything to say about. They don't say anything about the airport. I don't know what there's to say about the airport. It's like a potentially could be important.
Yeah, you know what I would like to mention about the airport?
Do it.
Because this just dawned on me while I was standing on the Common. I was with a cousin who was in town from Alaska this week, and but grew up around here. And we were walking around downtown. I was showing some of the new development. And as someone I grew up right next to the airport on one of the hills like that are like parallel to it. So it was like that's what woke you up all the time was like just the engines firing up, 20 minutes before taxi. It was like that was enough to like rattle the entire neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And we were standing down on the Common, and the JetBlue flights are like flying overhead and other flights and whatnot. And it dawned on me that planes don't make any noise anymore. Like, I feel this was something that we were talking about when we started bringing aircraft back up to Worcester Airport, that you kind of had the folks that had lived there long enough or moved in before, like, since the air traffic was a significant factor, and there was a lot of like, sort of grumbling in the corner, like, we moved in next to the pig farm, right? Like, because the airport's coming back alive. But so much has changed in terms of air traffic over the last 30 years that, like, planes aren't...
These are like higher efficiency engine, quieter engines.
It's kind of like when you pull up alongside a Prius. Like, it's there, it's capable of moving, but
you can kind of feel it's there, but you can't quite hear that.
You have no idea what's going on. Or a Tesla is probably a better example now. Planes, yeah, it's kind of cool.
They have a bunch of recommendations, most of which are literally our transit should be better. Some of the specific recommendations. Under public transit, they say, quote, the WRTA should partner with ride-sharing alternatives, including entities as Uber and Lyft. See, for example, Lyft's Friends with Transit initiative.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
And taxis and livery services, etc. So that sounds good.
I am really excited to see where that goes between 2018 and 2019. Again, I just can't imagine that our Secretary of Transportation would be a part of that steering committee, and we would not have something meaningful happening at a minimum in Boston, but hopefully bleeding over to Worcester.
Please, let's do it in Worcester. The other thing, the other area where they talk about something that is specific is when they're talking about future scenarios. Quote, automation will undoubtedly impact road infrastructure and travel patterns. Parking should be phased out in new downtown projects using the framework in place in the city's commercial corridor overlay district. Parking maximums rather than parking minimums should be standard in zoning. I feel like this is an interest. This to me says the new research bureau. I feel like the old research bureau would have been like pave it all,
just knock everything down, build a parking lot.
Yeah.
Transportation related. How are you feeling about? Have you had any encounters or engagement with self-driving Teslas with their latest sort of update that's like almost automated everything but red lights?
I've never, to my knowledge, seen a self-driving vehicle.
Okay. No, it was something I noticed. I think it was Christine Peterson over at the Telegram threw a really funny tweet a couple weeks back where it was just a copy and paste from the Mass State Police. I think it was heard on the scanner though. A number of motorists on the Mass Pike. Calling the state police frantically to report a gentleman in a fast-moving Tesla with both feet out the window playing the guitar, and it was like I'm trying to have this visual in my head of like a dude in a Hawaiian shirt just playing the ukulele, like cruising 80 miles an hour down the Mass Pike, and I'm just because you don't see Teslas are one of those things like a Maserati, like you might see one a month in Worcester, and you're like, how'd that guy get lost?
Not for me, not even once a month.
You don't see that many of them around here. I'm just really curious what other people's experiences are and feelings now that that's like a totally real thing. That it seems like it was only 5-6 years ago that we were talking about, self-driving vehicles in this hypothetical that, decades away, and they're here. It's part of this. It's a loose part of bigger transportation conversations that I feel is people are mostly just kind of willfully ignoring because it's not their vehicle, and a lot of folks I don't feel it's like smartphones, right? Like. Before the iPhone existed, nobody really saw room in their life for a smartphone because you never had one, and it was like a solution to a problem that nobody had really identified for themselves yet.
Right.
But now this thing is here, and there's a lot you can take off the table if you don't actually have to pilot a vehicle in that, whether it be the 5-minute commute or the 40-minute commute. There's a lot that can be done there if driving is not the thing you're going to be focused on.
Is this going to connect in a lot to marijuana legalization too? Do you think?
That's a really well. I was trying to think that I forgot to ask. It's a question I was going to ask somebody I ran into the other day. Like in the Commonwealth, so you've got a vehicle that is now by the factory standards can take care of itself up to I think being the first car to red light. I think is the only thing they haven't pushed down in terms of software updates. So it still needs help figuring out where to stop and when to stop at a red light if you're the first car. So like, yeah, if you're intoxicated and like, what if you're like intoxicated and you hop in the back seat? Like, I'm nowhere near the steering wheel. I'm not doing anything wrong here. Or you take a nap. I mean, things that you shouldn't do, but like,
I'm high, but the robot's not high.
The robot's not high. The robot is just fine. Like, have we figured that out yet? Like, do we know what? We got some homework to do, Mike.
The last thing I read, we tried to not snark too much and not be too pointlessly critical and bitchy. This next thing is about the Worcester City Council, so those provisos are out
off the table.
Window. Worcester City Council, cool to tax hike for multifamily housing of 5 units or more, says the Telegram and Gazette headline. This doesn't mean that they think that this tax hike is cool.
Yeah.
They mean that they're not that excited
They're not that excited about it.
It's like a little bit of a weird headline. This is an article by Nick Kotsopoulos. So this is something that we've been talking about for months, the idea that since Worcester has a dual property tax rate, we tax residential property at one rate and commercial property at the other rate, that right now big apartment buildings would be considered residential because they're residential. But you could say, well, it's commercial.
It's a business.
So it's a business, so maybe we should tax it as a business instead. And if we did, because our business tax is higher than our residential tax currently, we could tax all these big apartment buildings at like make them pay way more property taxes, and then we would have so much money, Brendan.
Sure,
it would be great. But the city council is like, it says here that the full council referred this proposal back to the municipal operations committee to rediscuss and restudy this because they expressed concerns about, quote, unintended consequences for tenants and landlords. The unintended consequence would be that apartments would be more expensive. How is this an unintended consequence? You raise taxes on living in an apartment building and it gets more expensive. How is that an unintended consequence? That's the whole point.
No, and this is where things get weird fast, because I think this is one of those sort of issues that's come up in the city that on the surface it kind of makes sense, right? Like, I mean, both of us kind of spit that out rather fluidly that, like, it's a business, so like you're fit in the business category. You don't
so strongly. I mean, go ahead.
What?
No,
go ahead. We're going to disagree, or
I feel like before, whenever I was saying it was a business, I was trying to say that in a sarcastic way.
Oh, well, because it's a business.
It is a business, but it's not like, I mean,
you're in the business of housing. That's right. Like, I mean, that's.
I'm just having a.
Is a hotel a business?
I'm having a rage seizure right now. Go ahead and talk.
But I think
not at you.
that is unintended consequences. Like, I mean, so you can't make giant shifts in housing and housing policy without expecting some of that to lay on the people who are paying those rents, right? Because that business is totally structured around the idea that there's demand for your space and someone's going to pay you to be there.
Yes.
And if that space ends up costing you more as the owner, it's going to cost the people who are living there more, or your profits are going to shrink. It's a no-brainer. All I was going to say was I think this is, again, kind of skirting around the bigger issue that we have a huge problem with our tax system in the local economy, and we need to really figure out a plan. You and I have been saying this, not necessarily in agreement, but we've been talking about this for at least a decade now. A long-term plan, wouldn't that have been nice a decade ago or 2 decades ago, to start shifting things back to a single tax rate? Because now we're at one of those points where there's tons of growth in Worcester, both on the housing side and the commercial side. And, we're actually at that point where if we had started this 10, 15 years ago, we'd be getting to the point where because of that increased development and increasing development, we could start seeing tax rates lower for both commercial and residential properties in unison, and everybody might be paying less. But now we're just in this weird game where someone's going to pay a little bit more this year, and somebody else is going to it's going to be kicked their way next year. How can we be legitimately having a conversation like Bill and Josh were right before us, Bill wrote about this week in Worcester Magazine, like a really well fleshed out piece on gentrification and the ups and downsides and the sort of middle road that we hope to be able to travel down on that front. We're having that conversation over here. Then over here is this like, well, we could definitely use a little bit more revenue. Let's stick it to the people who are renting. It just doesn't make any sense.
This article frustrates me. I'm sure the debate would have frustrated me because 2 counselors who I like and respect say stuff that I don't really like or respect. Both Sean Rose and Matt Wally are talking about. It says Sean Rose, the committee chairman, said the proposed change is a matter of fairness. Those who own buildings with 5 or more housing units should be taxed at the commercial tax rate because that's the threshold in which properties like that are considered a business. And my feeling is I think fairness is important. I don't think this has zero to do with fairness. Like, why? Like, the fact that we tax commercial and residential properties at a different rate to begin with is just this totally arbitrary, crazy thing. The fact that it changes every year. Like the council next year could make the residential tax rate even lower, I guess, and make the commercial tax rate even higher, or make the commercial tax rate way lower than the residential tax rate if they wanted to. It could change any given year. The fact that these are the two bundles that we bundle things into seems completely arbitrary and frustrating to me. It forces every municipality to make these big policy decisions around, I don't know, whether you want the price of commercial real estate or residential real estate to be higher or lower year to year, and making people do all this guesswork about what the city council will look like 20 years from now when you try to sell your house. All of this seems so arbitrary and crazy and stupid. I wish we had a unified tax rate so that we didn't have to have this argument about what was fair and what falls into what category.
Yeah.
I want to put this in the same area as, there's we spend so much time like assessing properties because property tax is important. So we spend all of this time having people go around the city, guess what your house is worth, even if you haven't sold your house in 20 years and don't expect to sell it in another 20. It's very important for us to know what the value is, for you to petition the council about what the value is. Go to these hearings at the state level, property, whatever, to decide what the value of your house is. This becomes so important just so that we can tax your house appropriately. There are alternative property tax schemes that would involve you putting up an estimate. Have you ever read about these?
No.
I'm not going to be able to describe them correctly. I think they generally call them Georgian tax rate after somebody George who came up with this. One of them involves that you tell the city what you think your property is worth. And then if somebody offers you either that much money or maybe like, let's say 20% more than that, you have to sell it to them.
Really?
Yeah. There's all these things where you get to decide what your property is worth, but you have incentives to make an accurate estimate.
Yeah.
And so then nobody has to go back in and check your math or inspect your property or nothing.
That seems like a great way to lose your house, but
again, I think it's you have to get that 20% right or whatever, that additional whatever it is amount right.
Which is pretty much what we do here. Right, except but the city has all the control on that front. Like our assessments don't line up with resale.
The city, right? In this case, the city is guessing, and the question is, how much do you want to fight the city's guess?
Well, no, I don't know that it's guessing as much as their goal in assessing is slightly different than the goal for a home buyer or a seller or someone refinancing. Right, like for the city to assess houses extremely high, like be very, very liberal and freewheeling, so we think this is crazy number, whatever the crazy number is, there's no upside for the city to do that. They're going to bring in revenue, but they're also going to be losing revenue at the number of vacant homes that are there with nobody left to pay taxes on them. If you're refinancing a house, right? Like if you're looking to take money out in equity or open a HELOC or whatnot, having a high assessment is in your favor, right? Because your home equity line of credit is going to be based on the equity that you have, and that free cash. That's when you want to start using the more sort of liberal assessments that you see on the residential market, where it might not be, no one can really say what your house is worth when you go to put it up for sale because you haven't sold it yet. And ultimately, that's what decides what the value is for that one moment in time. So we can look at comparable homes in your neighborhood, style of build, year of build, updates and whatnot, and try and cobble something together. Those tend to be a little bit higher because they're favoring the seller, at least in a healthy market. But there's no reason why there's no value in the city doing that. But I think that margin probably still fits within that 20% range.
Well, anyway, your excitement around this makes me think that I should get one of these papers about Georgian property tax rates and read it. And
we can yell at each other for an hour.
Well, we could talk about it next week. I feel like I've looked at some of these, and it does seem to me like there's insufficient provision for the fact that you kind of don't want to suddenly have to wake up one morning and realize,
someone bought my house.
Somebody bought my house. Too bad for me. I'm moving out tomorrow.
But I think the takeaway, though, is that I think we agree at the core is that it's the silliness of our taxation system is what is the problem, and these are all quick fixes. We could have a nuanced debate about whether or not business or residential. I mean, that's neither here nor there. The problem is that the city needs revenue, and we have been sitting on our hands for decades as to the best way to capture that revenue, which in the Commonwealth tends to come from property taxes.
In this case, it just seems like the, quote, unintended, I should say intended consequence of this is that it just says, you know what, Brendan, living in a 4-unit building is going to be cheaper for you than living in a 30-unit building.
Right.
Why that should be? Fairness. That's why it doesn't make any sense.
And the arbitrary side of things is what's important, right? I mean, because what the city is essentially doing now, whether you look at it within a 5-unit dwelling versus a 6-unit dwelling under this plan, or commercial versus residential, the city has really just decided it's going to tax denim differently than it's going to tax plaid. And there's no rhyme or reason as to why denim should be costing more money than plaid should be costing if they are fulfilling the same purpose of keeping us somewhat warm. I don't know.
Yes. I mean, honestly, it seems like a smarter thing would be to, I mean, again, I guess they can't do this, but really the thing would be to say, let's just like crank up the property tax rate gradually the more and more units in your building.
Yeah.
So like once you have a 1 million unit building, like it will be like impossibly expensive, but it will also be like have the density of a neutron star. It'll be incredible.
It's also important too to point out that the idea of taxing property is a game that has been like a cat and mouse sort of thing for as long as taxation of property has existed, right? Like there's still a couple homes up in the Burncoat area, if I'm not mistaken, that are those like really awkward things where the front door is on the side and they're like 1,000,000 miles long and they're only 5 feet wide because we used to tax frontage.
There used to be a lot of farms in Michigan called ribbon farms because it would be the frontage on the river, so every farm would be the shape of a ribbon. It would have the minimum number of yards on the river and it'd be as many miles long as possible.
Yeah, no, and I mean, again, ultimately, I think the conversation needs to be how do we start unifying that tax rate while simultaneously be taking care of the most vulnerable in the community as well too. You know, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to lock in tax rates for elderly folks. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to give tax breaks to young families and first-time home buyers or whatnot. Is because in that middle ground there's just so much to capture with a unified tax rate in conjunction with the kind of growth that we're seeing today.
I would love to lock in tax rates for the elderly. I feel like that would get away from the kind of annual drama that we have around the bus budget. This thing where every year we have to say like, well, what about like the poor seniors on a fixed income? Are we going to kick them out in the street? And it's like, I wish we could have the conversation with saying like, we care about the poor seniors. Let's have the conversation.
I feel like the show ended a half hour ago and Gabby just forgot to tell us.
We may or may not be on the air.
No, but
you, listener, are in our hearts. This is 508, a show about Worcester. We're going to keep talking here, and we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.